I think for someone like you, really steeped in philosophy, the question of how we as humans should organize ourselves, on a global scale, it must be, I don't know, just endlessly fascinating.
It's a question that really gets to the heart of political philosophy, right? I mean, this idea of a single authority governing all of humankind, that touches on some pretty fundamental ideas about sovereignty, justice, even the nature of community itself.
Absolutely. And to really get into the nuances of this concept, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on world government. This is a deep dive, centuries of debate all laid out for us.
That's right.
So what we're going to be doing today is dissecting the main arguments, both for and against this idea, kind of tracing how they've evolved over time and, connecting back to those core principles that really drive philosophical inquiry. We want to give you a structured understanding of this, like this intellectual wrestling match.
Yeah, it's a debate that's been going on for a long time, and it really gets to the core of how we think about politics and society.
Exactly. So where do we begin this exploration? Well, I think we should start by looking at some of the earliest expressions of this idea, from ancient ideas of unity to, more sophisticated arguments like those presented by Dante in the medieval period.
Yeah, and then we can move on to the shifts in thinking that came with the rise of the sovereign state, looking at thinkers like Hobbes, Rousseau, and Kant.
And then finally, we'll dive into the really diverse perspectives of contemporary theorists across international relations, liberal, Republican, democratic, and critical post-colonial thought. But always, always keeping that focus on the philosophical reasoning behind each viewpoint.
It's a rich and complex history of ideas, that's for sure.
So let's jump right in.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing to think that this impulse towards some form of human unity, it's not new at all. Even in ancient civilizations, whether we're talking about imperial China or the Indian subcontinent or the Greco-Roman world, there were these philosophical and political concepts that hinted at this broader sense of shared humanity.
Yeah, and what's fascinating from a philosophical perspective is how often this idea of a shared human nature, this idea of a common good, has been linked to the aspiration for some form of political unity. But of course, the way that's been expressed has taken very different forms throughout history.
Right. And so our first, I guess, major philosophical exploration takes us to 14th century Italy, to the thought of Dante Alighieri.
Dante, known for his poetic exploration of the afterlife, but
Yeah.
also a pretty keen political thinker in his own right.
Exactly. So in the Banquet, and especially in De Monarchia, he lays out a really, compelling argument for a universal monarch.
He does.
So what were like the central philosophical pillars of his case? What was he trying to get at?
Well, for Dante, the most important thing was to eliminate war. And his logic was actually quite simple, almost elegant in its simplicity. If a single ruler possesses everything, there's no incentive for war, for territorial disputes between lesser rulers. So by removing the root cause of conflict, that desire for more, you could secure peace. It's this ancient idea that unified power is the ultimate peacemaker. You see it echoed in various forms through our history.
Yeah, move the motive, remove the action, right?
Exactly. And Dante's argument goes even deeper. He draws on Aristotelian ideas, suggesting that what makes humanity unique, our capacity for intellect, our shared potential for reason, is the real basis for unity. He believed that peace was absolutely essential for us to fulfill this potential, something a divided and warring world could never achieve. So unity wasn't just about the absence of conflict, it was a prerequisite for us to flourish together.
So like a unified political structure as a means to a higher state of being almost.
Exactly, a higher state of intellectual and perhaps even spiritual development for humanity as a whole. And he also argued that in any system with multiple, equally powerful rulers, conflicts are bound to happen. To resolve those disputes justly, you need a supreme judge, someone with universal jurisdiction. Without that, he thought, humanity becomes this chaotic, many-headed beast, driven by contradictory desires.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah.
And of course, he contrasts this with the idea that a unified humanity under a single monarch would reflect the oneness of God, right? A very
Yeah.
medieval way of thinking about political order.
Very much so. And he looked to the Roman Empire as an example of this principle, albeit an imperfect one. He saw it as part of a divine plan. And he was very careful to navigate the complex relationship between the emperor's temporal authority and the pope's spiritual power, envisioning a kind of harmonious cooperation between the two.
Right. But then, as we all know, the 17th century rolls around, and the Peace of Westphalia basically establishes the system of sovereign states that we still have today. Each state with, exclusive control within its territory. And this really shifts the conversation, doesn't it? Away from this idea of a universal monarch.
Absolutely. What's philosophically significant here is that the rise of sovereign states leads to a new way of thinking about international order. Instead of focusing on unifying authority, the emphasis shifts to managing relations between these independent states. And that brings us to Thomas Hobbes.
Hobbes, the ultimate pragmatist, so concerned with avoiding chaos.
Yes, and famously, he argues for a strong sovereign within a state to escape the horrors of what he called the state of nature.
Right, right. So what was his take on a global sovereign?
It's interesting. Hobbes saw the dangers of individuals in the state of nature as so dire that they absolutely required an all-powerful sovereign to keep them in check. But he argued that the miseries of anarchy between states were not as catastrophic for individuals.
Why is that?
Well, he thought states themselves provide a degree of security and order. They uphold domestic order, they allow for industry and commerce to flourish. So the need for a global leviathan, for him, was much weaker.
So the level of suffering that you see in, like, international anarchy is not the same as in a completely stateless society, so we don't need that world state as much.
Precisely. But, and this is important, Hobbes wasn't saying states should just isolate themselves. He understood that leagues and alliances between commonwealths, based on shared interests, could be rational and mutually beneficial. It's like an early understanding of the potential for international law and cooperation, even without a world government.
So a world of independent states engaging in strategic alliances and partnerships, rather than a single power above them. Now, moving into the Enlightenment, we see this resurgence of interest in the idea of perpetual peace, often tied to these proposals for some form of international federation.
Right. Thinkers like the Abbé de Saint-Pierre come to mind.
Exactly. His project for perpetual peace in Europe. So what was his, core idea?
His idea, which was very influential at the time, was that European rulers should enter into a kind of social contract. They would form this permanent federation with a congress to settle disputes. Just like individuals give up some freedoms in exchange for security within a state, states would cede some sovereignty to this federal body to ensure peace. Any state that violated the treaty would be considered an enemy of the federation and subject to collective enforcement.
It sounds like a pretty rational plan on the surface.
It does.
So what did Rousseau, the great skeptic of the Enlightenment, what did he make of all this?
Rousseau, with his deep understanding of human nature, he actually acknowledged the theoretical perfection of Saint-Pierre's plan. He even said that if such a European Commonwealth existed for just one day, its benefits would be so obvious that it would last forever.
But there's a but, isn't there?
Oh, there's always a but with Rousseau. He believed that existing societies had corrupted individuals to the point that they were basically incapable of recognizing their own battle interests, let alone acting on them, even when presented with such a rational plan for peace. So Saint-Pierre's ideas might have been sound in theory, but in practice. Well, to put it bluntly, Rousseau thought, men are crazy.
Pretty pessimistic.
Yeah. He also raised a consequentialist objection, something any philosopher would appreciate. Even if a world government was a good thing in the long run, the process of creating it, the potential for tyranny, the upheaval, all that might cause more suffering than the current state of affairs. So the means could actually undermine the ends.
The classic problem of means and ends.
Exactly. And Rousseau also had a different view on why war happens in the first place. Unlike those who saw it as this inherent feature of the state of nature, he argued that war is actually a product of states, of these flawed social institutions. He thought that by entering into civil society, we'd inadvertently made war far more destructive than it ever was between individuals. His solution wasn't a global political entity, but the moral improvement of individual states. A world of just and well-governed societies, he thought, would naturally be peaceful. They wouldn't need a world government.
Interesting. So it's a bottom-up approach, focusing on the internal health of each state, as opposed to Dante's top-down imposition of unity. Now, let's move on to Kant. He offers yet another, intricate perspective on all of this.
Kant, always the system builder, he actually tries to address Rousseau's critiques of the state head-on. Well, he argues that nature itself, through what he calls humanity's unsociableness, pushes us toward progress, even if that progress comes through conflict. By unsociableness, he means our competitive instincts, our tendency towards antagonism, which of course manifests itself in war.
So even our negative tendencies can lead to something good in the long run.
That's the idea. Kant saw war as a painful but ultimately necessary mechanism. It forces states to move beyond this lawless state of nature and form a federation of peoples. In this federation, security and rights are guaranteed not by individual states but by a collective body, so war becomes this catalyst for a more unified order.
Fascinating.
Kant even talks about the inevitable outcome of history being an international state. However, and this is important, he immediately qualifies this. He argues that under current conditions, this idea of a world republic, a single global state, well, that's just too dangerous.
What were his main objections?
He had a few, and they're still relevant today. The tyranny argument is central. He worried that a world government with so much power concentrated in one place would inevitably become despotic. Instead of protecting freedom, it would suppress it. He said it would become the graveyard of freedom. It's a really powerful insight into the risks of unchecked power, no matter the scale.
Yeah, a chilling thought.
He also raised the issue of inefficiency and soullessness. A global authority, he argued, would be too remote, too bureaucratic. Its laws would be diluted, ineffective, and out of touch with the needs of diverse people. It would lack that vital connection, that accountability that you get with governance that's closer to the people.
So, on one hand, you have the potential for tyranny through over-centralization, and on the other, you have ineffectiveness through, too much distance and bureaucracy.
Exactly. It's a tough balance to strike. But Kant does offer a more pragmatic path towards perpetual peace. He calls it a Pacific Federation. Basically, it's a voluntary association of free republican states. It doesn't aim to become a superstate, but it exists simply to prevent war and protect the freedom of each member. He saw this as a more achievable and desirable goal than either a universal monarchy or a world republic.
A league of, I guess, well-ordered, internally just states, all committed to peaceful coexistence.
Right. And he also introduces this concept of cosmopolitan right.
Right, but it's not about global citizenship in the political sense, is it?
No, it's more limited than that. It's the right of a visitor to be treated with hospitality, not as an enemy in any state. It's a principle of universal hospitality rooted in our shared humanity, but it doesn't extend to the right to conquer or settle without consent. He was very critical of the colonial practices of his time, actually.
So to sum up Kant's view, it's a mix of things. There's this distant ideal of a world republic, but also a strong warning about the dangers of a universal state. And then there's this more attainable idea of a federation of free states as the best way to achieve lasting peace, alongside this right to universal hospitality.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that even in Kant's time, there were more radical cosmopolitan thinkers, like Anacharsis Cloots, who wanted to abolish the state system altogether and create a single universal republic. But as Kant himself suggested, many of these early projects for perpetual peace were very Eurocentric. They didn't take non-European perspectives into account, and they often ignored the injustices of colonialism.
It seems like the 19th and 20th century saw a revival of these world government proposals, right? Often driven by things like technological advances and the horrors of war.
Yes, definitely. But sometimes these ideas were mixed up with some pretty problematic ideologies.
In what sense?
Well, it's troubling to see how the idea of global unity was sometimes connected to racialized theories of progress and colonial expansion. Some proponents imagined a world order led by a small group of supposedly civilized nations.
A pretty disturbing vision of global governance.
Absolutely. Even H.G. Wells, who later changed his views, initially imagined a new republic dominated by Anglo-American powers with a civilizing mission that often justified the subjugation of non-European peoples. The inclusion of non-Europeans in these schemes was often framed within hierarchical structures of power.
Right. Then, of course, you have the two world wars, especially the atomic bombings.
Which gave the idea of world government a new urgency. People were terrified of global annihilation.
Understandably.
Scientists like Albert Einstein became vocal advocates for international control of atomic energy, arguing that this was a necessary function of a world federalist government. Organizations like the United World Federalists emerged, calling for the UN to be transformed into a real global federation with the power to regulate armaments. The basic argument was that states had to give up some of their sovereignty if they wanted to prevent global self-destruction.
The scale of modern warfare really exposed the limitations of the nation-state system.
It did. Thinkers like Emery Reeves, in his book The Anatomy of Peace, went so far as to condemn the nation-state as the modern equivalent of the Bastille. He argued that it inherently leads to conflict and undermines peace and justice. Others, like David Matrani, took a more gradual approach, suggesting that peace could be built through a network of international collaborations and specialized agencies.
And then there was the Atlantic Union Committee. They wanted the Federation of Democracies, seeing authoritarian regimes as obstacles to a peaceful world.
Right. But then the Cold War happened, which created a huge ideological divide and made any talk of world government incredibly suspicious.
Of course, the Soviet Union and its allies saw these Western initiatives as attempts to impose capitalism and American dominance. And they had their own vision of a future world order based on Marxist-Leninist ideology.
Yes, for Marx and Engels, history was all about class struggle, not national rivalry. The state was just a tool of the ruling class. Their vision was a proletarian revolution leading to a classless society, which would eventually mean the end of national conflict. Lenin, of course, adapted these ideas, emphasizing the importance of seizing state power and supporting anti-imperialist movements.
But in reality, the Soviet Union, with its own forms of authoritarian control and its own geopolitical ambitions, didn't really live up to this ideal of a stateless, peaceful world order.
No, it didn't, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union seemed to mark the end of that particular challenge to the Western-dominated international system. The 1990s, remember, were a time of optimism, with this sense that liberal democracy and market capitalism had triumphed.
The so-called end of history, right?
Right. Neoliberal globalization became the dominant model, with a focus on free trade, deregulation, and the influence of international financial institutions. But this optimism didn't last. Inequality, regional conflicts, global crises like the 2008 financial meltdown, and climate change all revealed the flaws and injustices in the system. Some even argued that this neoliberal order was creating a new kind of global state, but one that served the interests of transnational capital.
So this aspiration for a unified, peaceful world is still very much contested, challenged by power, inequality, and conflict, which brings us to the present day.
And to the debates happening right now in international relations theory, it's fascinating to see how the different schools of thought approach the possibility and desirability of world government.
Right. They each draw on different assumptions about human nature and the way power works.
Realists and neorealists, for instance, are very skeptical.
I mean, they're starting from this idea of international anarchy, right?
Yeah.
Where states are ultimately self-interested and just trying to survive.
Exactly. They see world government as utopian and impractical, given human nature and the way states guard their sovereignty. Waltz, the narrowist thinker, argued that a system of independent states is actually more stable than a world government.
Because a world government would just become another power player, right?
Yes, and it could easily become tyrannical. Now, some classical realists, like Niebuhr, Carr, and Morgenthau, were more open to the idea of global institutional reforms, especially given the destructive power of modern warfare. But even they had serious doubts.
About whether a world government could really work and whether it would just end up being tyrannical.
Right. Then you have the International Society School, sometimes called the English School.
And they have a different take, right?
They argue that even without a world government, there's already a kind of international society with shared norms, rules, and institutions.
So a world government is unnecessary, maybe even dangerous.
That's their view. They emphasize the value of a world of diverse, morally autonomous political communities that can cooperate within a framework of peace and international law.
So order through shared understandings, rather than a single authority.
Interesting.
Then there are the liberal internationalists. They're more critical of the traditional idea of absolute state sovereignty, especially when it gets in the way of addressing global issues like poverty, human rights, and climate change.
So they're not necessarily calling for a world government, but they want more humane governance, right?
Exactly. They focus on things like strengthening democracy, reforming the UN, and promoting global civil society.
So working within the system, trying to improve it rather than replacing it entirely.
Yes. And Anne-Marie Slaughter, with her idea of global governance through government networks, offers a good example of this approach. She argues that states are becoming more interconnected through networks of officials who cooperate to solve problems, even without a global sovereign.
It's a more decentralized and collaborative model. But isn't there a risk that this approach might not be enough to tackle truly global challenges? That's a valid concern. Some scholars, like Thomas Weiss, worry that by moving away from the idea of world government, we might be handicapping ourselves. And then, of course, there's constructivist theory.
Which focuses on how our understanding of the world is shaped by social interactions.
Exactly. Alexander Wendt, for instance, argues that even the logic of anarchy that realists talk about can change over time.
So even though the world seems anarchic now, it doesn't have to stay that way.
Right. He argues that through interaction and competition, states can eventually evolve towards a world state. It might take a long time, but he sees it as a potential outcome.
Interesting. What would that process look like?
He talks about different stages, from a security community where states no longer expect to fight each other, to collective security where they cooperate to address threats, and finally to some form of supranational authority.
It sounds almost like a Hegelian view of history.
It does have that flavor of historical progression. But it's important to note that even within constructivism, there are different views on what the best form of global political organization would be. For example, Daniel Dodney, whose work influenced Wendt, has argued more recently for a less centralized system, what he calls a negarchic, Republican Federalist world order.
So even if we accept that the world is evolving towards greater unity, there's still debate about what that unity should look like. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about liberal theory more broadly. It seems like many liberals are wary of the idea of world government.
Right. Yes. What's interesting from a philosophical perspective is that even cosmopolitan liberals who believe in a universal moral community don't usually advocate for a global leviathan.
So why not? If they believe in universal values, why not want a single government to uphold them?
Their main concern, much like Kant's, is that such a concentration of power would be both unnecessary and dangerous. It could easily become tyrannical and threaten individual liberties.
Rawls makes this point very clearly in his book, The Law of Peoples, right?
He does. He explicitly rejects the idea of a world state, worried about the potential for despotism and instability. Many other liberal thinkers share this view. They argue that a world government isn't needed to achieve things like peace, justice, and human rights.
So they would prefer a system of strong international institutions and cooperation between states, but without a single global authority.
Exactly. They focus on multi-layered governance and the dispersal of sovereignty rather than a single, all-powerful state.
And there are other liberal critiques too, right? Like the communitarian perspective.
Right. Communitarians like Michael Walzer worry that a world government would threaten cultural diversity. They fear that a single global authority would impose a kind of uniformity, undermining the unique values and practices of different societies. Even some liberal nationalists share this concern about the erosion of national identity.
So for liberals, the emphasis is on balancing individual rights with the need to protect diversity and local economy.
Precisely. Now, another interesting perspective comes from Republican and Democratic theorists. They focus on the potential for globalization and international institutions to actually undermine democracy at the national level.
Because decisions are being made by distant, unaccountable bodies, right?
Exactly. They worry about the erosion of civic participation and popular sovereignty within individual countries.
And the Republican idea of non-domination is central here, isn't it?
It is. Philip Pettit, a prominent Republican theorist, argues that international order should be based on non-dominating relationships between states. And he's very skeptical of world government. He thinks it would be far too prone to domination.
So how do Republicans propose to achieve this non-dominating order?
Pettit emphasizes things like multilateral institutions and solidarity among weaker states. But others, like Cecile Laborde, point out that international organizations themselves can become sources of domination.
That's a good point, and it complicates things.
It does. Interestingly, some Republican thinkers, like Nancy Kochas, actually argue for a global republic as a way to protect local communities from the forces of global capitalism, which they see as a threat to Republican freedom.
So even within Republicanism, there are different views on world government.
Yes. And James Bowman, another Republican theorist, argues that achieving genuine freedom in a globalized world requires a move towards what he calls transnational democracy. This means that the very definition of political communities and the boundaries of membership have to become subjects of democratic deliberation across different groups. He sees things like the European Union and the rise of transnational public spheres as potential steps in this direction.
So Republicans are grappling with how to protect democratic values and individual freedom in a globalized world, and there's no easy answer. Some want a reformed international system, while others are exploring more integrated forms of global governance.
Exactly. And finally, we have to consider the critical and post-colonial perspectives. They bring a whole different set of concerns to the table, focusing on the historical and ongoing role of capitalism and power imbalances.
Right. They tend to be very critical of the idea of a neutral or benign form of globalization.
Yes. They see globalization as a process driven by the interests of corporations and powerful states, often at the expense of the developing world. Some even argue that we're already seeing the emergence of a neoliberal world state, one that reinforces existing patterns of domination and inequality.
So a world government, in their view, might already be happening, but not in a good way.
Right. They wouldn't necessarily want to go back to a world of isolated states, but they emphasize the need for transnational solidarity and resistance to this form of global domination. Some also argue for strengthening the sovereignty of third world states as a way to push back against the pressures of global capitalism.
And indigenous thinkers offer a particularly powerful critique here, right?
They do. They challenge the very foundations of the state system, arguing that it's rooted in settler colonialism. They advocate for alternative models of recognition and self-determination that go beyond both traditional state sovereignty and capitalism.
So any discussion of world government has to take these historical legacies and ongoing power imbalances into account.
Absolutely. So, as we reach the end of our deep dive into this incredibly complex topic, it's clear that there are no easy answers. We've explored historical ideals, skeptical counterarguments, and a wide range of contemporary perspectives. Each one offers valuable insights into the challenges of organizing political life on a global scale.
And as you, our philosophically inclined listener, have surely noticed, this isn't just an abstract intellectual exercise. The philosophical principles at play here, ideas like autonomy, justice, peace, and self-determination, these are all deeply relevant to the real-world problems we face today.
And that leads to a crucial question for you to ponder. Given all that we've discussed, what kind of global political architecture, if any, do you think is most likely to create a more just and peaceful world? And what kinds of trade-offs might be involved?
It might be helpful to revisit the works of some of the thinkers we've mentioned, like Dante, Kant, or Rawls. Or perhaps you'd like to explore the different schools of thought in international relations theory in more depth. We encourage you to look at contemporary events through the lenses we discussed today.
Ultimately, engaging with this idea of world government, even if we don't arrive at a definitive answer, forces us to think critically about the nature of political order, the challenges of globalization, and the possibilities for human cooperation on a grand scale.
Thank you for joining us for this philosophical deep dive. We hope it's given you a more nuanced and informed understanding of this important and ongoing debate.